Hi, it's Richard here from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with another one in our series of videos about control extensions. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at a unique variation on the theme of input controls. We're going to be talking about options control extensions. Before we begin, just a quick summary of what we're talking about here. We're talking about a control extension which you will build into Oracle Policy Modeling and which will be deployed as part of your Intelligent Advisor project in the form of a JavaScript file. The JavaScript file will be written to leverage the Intelligent Advisor JavaScript extension API as documented online in the Oracle Intelligent Advisor Online Help. Every extension has essentially a type. We call it a type key, which allows us to identify and allows Intelligent Advisor to identify what kind of extension it is. So in previous chapters, we've looked at custom labels and custom inputs, and this time round, we're going to be looking at custom options, but there are many, many more that we'll be visiting in other episodes in this series. A control extension basically leverages objects, methods, functions made available through this API and typically uses one or more event keys to ensure that you write your code in the right place. For example, an input extension has an event key called validate, which allows you to write code to validate whether what the user has entered meets your particular conditions. There are strict rules documented online as to what we should and should not do with these JavaScript extensions. We should, under no circumstances, attempt to modify the outcome of the determination. What that means is the JavaScript is not intending to replace the determination engine, but what we should be using this for is to transform the look and feel and the user experience of this interview or that this control extension is part of to create something new, create something more attractive, create something that better meets the needs of the users. How do you get started with extensions? Well, it's really simple. You either write them from scratch or you look in the online documentation. You'll find 2 or 3 examples. Or you use a generator to generate template code that you can then edit. There is a code generator available on our website, which allows you to generate boilerplate or starter code for all of the currently available extensions. And you can add in comments and a few other features to test drive extensions really easily. Okay, so let's get down to business. We're here to talk about custom options. What does the custom options extension do? Well, it does something very specific and very unique. It allows us to define a list of choices that the user will select from. They are displayed in one of 4 ways. You can have them as a drop-down, have them as radio buttons, have them as text buttons, or as a combo, a searchable combo, a filtered drop-down, if you will. The actual values that you place in this control can come from anywhere. They can come from your code, they can come from a JavaScript object, they can come from an external source, they can come from another entity, they can come from just about anywhere. The only thing that you need to remember is that you need to package your options in a particular way so that the extension API understands what the options are, what the values are, and what the display text is. So whatever you choose to do with your custom options, however you choose to present them, you will need to conform to a simple structure, which we'll see again and again in this chapter. So unlike all of the custom extensions seen so far, the options extension really doesn't use keys like mount, unmount, and so forth. Your basic goal is to provide a function that returns an array of objects, and each object will have a text property and a value property. If you look at the screenshot over here, basically what you're going to be building is an array of objects. And if you consider that each of the rows you see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows, each of those you consider as an object with a value property and a display text property, that's pretty much what you're going to be building. It's called a value property and a text property, and you're going to wrap it all up as an array of objects. That's what you're going to build. But unlike the others, you're not going to have a mount or an unmount or a validate or an update. You're really just going to go straight in and write a function that returns or write some code that returns this kind of array of objects. So now we've understood that basically our job is to create an array of objects, and the array of objects represent the choices a user can select from. There are a couple of other things that you can do. You could, for example, write it as a function or return null in the first instance, which will cause Intelligent Advisor to display a spinner, a little rotating image to show the user that the values aren't yet available. And then when they become available, then the display will happen. We'll see an example of this in a video and a walkthrough at the end of this chapter. But that's it, really. There's no mount, unmount, validate, or update. This can make it harder in the sense that to process changes or to check whether the user is doing what they should be doing, you don't have those built-in Intelligent Advisor mechanisms. So you might find yourself, for example, writing standard JavaScript or jQuery code to look for key down or key up, or to look for changes in values in these controls, because you don't have any easy mechanism to find them using the JavaScript API. So here's a really simple reminder, is that at its simplest, your job is to produce one of these, is to produce an array of objects with values and texts. This is true for any control with any kind of options. And in fact, if you dig a little, you'll see that when you look at a Boolean control, even a standard Boolean control has options. And those options are displayed are stored in exactly the same way, with a value and a text. The value being true and false, and the text being yes and no by default. So that's our goal, is to build one of these with whatever values and whatever text display value we want to have. Here's the basic layout of an option extension. As you can see, it has custom options as its key. And then it's essentially you writing code wrapped in a function. And you'll see that the API passes in a reference to the control and a reference to the interview, so you can easily access control properties and interview properties. The only thing that might seem a little unusual here is the control type. The control type isn't required unless you've built something in design time in the interview tab of Oracle Policy Modeling, where it's not clear what kind of display you want to have. Do you want a drop down? Do you want radio buttons? For example, if all you've done is place a single line input in the interview, you will need to specify the control type so that Intelligent Advisor knows how to display it. We'll see an example of changing the control type on in the code at the end of this chapter when we look at some of the videos of use cases. Okay, so you're probably thinking, well, we can do this with value lists. We can do this with screen lists. Why do I need an options custom options extension? Well, the first thing is this. You could use, because you're looking at an array of objects, you could use an array filter to filter the contents of the dropdown or whatever it is on the fly. So you could do something a little more sophisticated than a hierarchy. You could remove values based on whatever conditions you could think of. The example you can see on the right-hand side of this slide is a really, really stupid and simple one. Is basically, we're going to show you a list of towns, and we're going to filter by the country attribute. Obviously, you could do this just by a hierarchy with a value list called country and a value list called towns, but it does illustrate the principle of being able to return a filtered array, so only showing exactly what you want to show. Don't do this if you can achieve what you're looking for with a standard hierarchical value list. Option number 2, or rather advantage number 2, and this is one that I wish was standard in the product, is now we could have a value list, or rather I should say we can have a list of options that can be built and driven directly by entity instances. In my case, I've actually created an inferred entity called the station, and I've inferred 5 stations, as you can see there. And those 5 values have become my options. Of course, this is dynamic, it's on the fly, this is not hard-coded. So if I add more stations and I rerun the project, I'll see my stations in the dropdown. It illustrates the fact that now entity instances can become the source of your array of objects. Third example, or rather another example, is that quite simply you can leverage other functionalities such as interview fetch. And in this case, what you're looking at is a list of custom options, and the options are actually coming from Oracle B2C Service Cloud using the sales product concept. So we're pulling those directly out of B2C Service. So let's take a look at a few of those examples in action. So this goes back to the first one, where we have an attribute called the country, and we have an attribute called the town. And I think you probably guessed we're going to filter the content of the town based on the country. We've added a custom property here so that in our JavaScript, we're able to identify which control we should run our code for. You know, maybe you have several drop-downs on the page. You don't want to run the code for every one of those drop-downs. So here's the code that I showed you a little bit earlier, is if the property is set, find the country, and then it says, okay, let's go get the list of options. So what we've done here is we've created a list of options to begin with, and then we're going to filter them. So I'll show you how that's done in a moment, but you can see that this is an array filter that will filter based on towns that include the name of the country. So Paris, France includes the name of France. So I told you a moment ago that we had a value list, and here they are. These are the list of values that were all recorded here in design time. So they are completely agnostic of town or country. But now when I go to my country and choose my town, country Germany, and I choose my town, the value list is filtered directly because of the array filter function. Let's look at the second example. This is going to be a drop-down, and it's going to be a station, and I'm going to choose from a list of stations. The stations here, you can see, are, in this case, an inferred entity with 5 stations. And I have a station entity here, and I have named it, and I've named the relationship as well. And I'm going to select a station. So we want to capture the station that the user selects. So we'll go and have a look at our example. You'll notice that it says control type is drop-down. So we're going to see a drop-down. And my stations is the name of the array of objects. And the array of objects is going to pull in, you'll see we're using get property entity name. So we've actually got a second custom property that tells us the entity name. We search for the entity, pull off the instances, and then we iterate through the number of instances in the entity, and we add them to our array of objects. So we'll go and look at our selected station here, and we'll look at our 2 custom properties, which include the entity name, as you saw. So when we execute our code, we can now see the list of stations dynamically showing up here from the entity. There they are. They're the inferred entities in this case. And I can select a station, click Next, and of course, the value is passed into the attribute. So the selected station is Waterloo. The third example, which we spoke about, is the idea of using interview fetch to populate a list of custom options. So this is a product that we'd like to register. You notice that this is actually in a entity-based display. So this is actually one second entity, and I'm pulling the same list each time. But I'm only actually pulling the list once. I'm not querying interview fetch each time. That's because we put the code, in this case, in a custom header. So the code is loaded when the interview loads, and it populates an array of objects called myArrayOfProducts using the typical interview fetch, and pushes those into a interview property called _myArrayOfProducts, so that each time we then decide to create a new instance of our entity, we'll be looking at the same array of products. We will only have called interview fetch once. The fourth scenario we're going to look at is the idea of using custom options with returning null. It may be that your retrieval of results takes a long-ish time. So what you don't want to have is the user just sitting there wondering what's happening. You have different ways of doing it, I suppose. You could use a traditional JavaScript spinner, so that if you were doing an interview fetch, for example, and you were recovering a promise, so you didn't know how long it was going to take, maybe you would display the typical JavaScript spinner while the promise is resolving. But Oracle Intelligent Advisor offers us a standard feature, which allows us to display a simple spinning icon while the value is null, so while the user is waiting. It's one way to ensure that the user understands what's going on. And then you could update the interview as and when values were available, or as and when your list could be constructed. So here's a very simple example of using that concept of returning null. In this case, this interview has, this is actually a sample interview, which I'm sure you know. It's called the travel compensation. We've changed it a little bit, so you're going to select where you're flying from, and then we're going to show you a list of airports. So if you select, for example, France, you'll see all the airports in France. Or if you select Germany, you'll see all the airports in Germany. So we can't retrieve the airports without using an external service. So we're using the ICAO APIs. These are great if you're looking for sample REST APIs, by the way, because you can use them for free with a limited license key. So we're going to do a good old-fashioned AJAX call to go and get those. Yes, I know we could do it in an interview fetch, but we'll do it in an AJAX call just for here. And we're going to return the airport name and the city name and display them in a nice way. And because the countries are formatted differently, we're going to only allow 2 countries, France or Germany, and we're going to trim them into FRA and DEU because that's the way the REST API wants them. Anyway, so we're going to run this and take a look at it. So you can see that airports has a spinner at the moment because, well, the airports array is null, but when I go to France and press return, my airports arrive. So I can select an airport. I'll go ahead and I'll blank this out again, and we'll set it to Germany this time. And we'll see that Germany provides a longer list of airports in this case. You'll notice that Germany shows radio buttons and France shows a drop-down. So a very basic and simple example of how to use null in a custom object, custom options. So what can I use as a summary? Well, our options extensions, you could consider them a one-trick pony, in the sense that they only do one particular job. They can, however, produce a large variety of effects and leverage other standard API concepts such as interview fetch, entity instances, custom filtering, and also, if necessary, using AJAX calls to go and get external data. I hope you enjoyed this short video. This is Richard from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting, saying see you next time.